So are there any proxies or stand-ins in your army? Or is every single model 100% what you see is what you get? Let's talk about the pros, cons and potential pitfalls of WYSIWYG and proxying in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd revisit the topic of WYSIWYG versus proxying in Warhammer, what it means and a few of the many nuances of it, and focus on a few of the potential negatives that both playing models absolutely as is, and also substituting things a bit too rashly might have for your games or your opponents. I'm sure this will be very well known to a lot of people watching, but WYSIWYG is what you see is what you get, basically playing your army with the exact miniature that Games Workshop suggests for the units. Maybe if there are any conversions at all, they're still basically keeping the same war gear, or the miniature very clearly still representing the one that Games Workshop has in the lore, maybe just with a slightly different aesthetic. Proxying, on the other hand, would be substituting in other miniatures or other bits of war gear to represent different things in game, and could definitely have a whole load of different levels, maybe very minor details on the models such as sidearms or combat knives or things like that, things that aren't exactly the main focus of the miniature. Then moving up to things like weapon swaps, say for example saying a bolt pistol is a plasma pistol or similar, and then maybe going on to counting entire miniatures as different ones, either substituting other Games Workshop Warhammer ones for other ones, or maybe using conversions or 3D prints that don't necessarily 100% line up. And say if you want to go the whole hog, you could go all the way up to just using tokens to represent the miniatures, maybe for things that you haven't got yet, or perhaps you managed to forget some miniatures at home. Perhaps replace a drop pod with a beer bottle, or a tank with a tape dispenser or something. I feel like to some extent, paint schemes could also be a part of this for certain armies like Space Marines. Some paint schemes for certain chapters having certain rules connotations. The whole point of this video is that attitudes to all of these can vary very widely. Some people just really don't like the idea or see absolutely no problem with proxy in various different ways. Though it is kind of interesting that attitudes can vary really quite big from game group to game group, or maybe setting to setting, say more tournament organised play versus more casual play. For the point of WYSIWYG, there's certainly plenty of people who just really like to use their models as is. I wouldn't dream of using a modelled gun as a different one, even if it was one that was directly better, as it's often the case that from edition to edition Games Workshop doesn't manage to balance war gear very well, and there's often just one obvious loadout that tends to be best, which might not be very helpful if you're trying to run a slightly stronger list and you've stuck in the thing that you were using last edition. I think there are plenty of good reasons for trying to aim towards WYSIWYG if you can. It helps with immersion and knowledge of the setting, wanting your guns to work how they look, I guess, basically. Maybe feeling like you've done the work to assemble something that then represents that loadout. Maybe holding off on using a fancy gun for a tank or a different special weapon on infantry until you've actually got the models together, maybe magnetised if you want to. And maybe more the sort of practical gameplay sort of point of view, not wanting to mislead your opponents. As we'll talk about later, I feel like there's certain proxies that you can absolutely get away with that aren't going to cause any major problems if clearly communicated, but if you go too heavy on it, it could be annoying. I do feel like going absolutely dedicated to what you see is what you get though certainly has its disadvantages as well as advantages. Say for example, units that have a massive amount of war gear choice, things like Chaos Havocs. Say if you were a Chaos Space Marine player and just wanted to collect an absolutely enormous army over the years, if you wanted to be able to just field 2 squads of any war gear option for the Havocs, you need a fairly crazy 42 miniatures just to field your 10 Havocs in any combination. So 8 each of the different war gear options, so las cannons, auto cannons, chain cannons, heavy bolters and missile launchers, and then 2 sergeants to go alongside them. Even they could have their own variant war gear choices that you might want to swap out depending on the list. That's take really quite a lot of hobby time and effort. Never mind the actual expense. If you went down the Games Workshop route of that, you could just take 2 Havoc kits and kit bash with regular legionaries. That'd get you enough of everything but the chain cannons unless you bought the kill team kit. But even so, it's not really going to be cheap just to have free war gear choice for literally just 2 units out of your army, never mind if you want to push it out to 3. Maybe that's a slightly over-the-top example. I couldn't really see many people going out to try and collect that sort of thing just to try and have the options for 1 unit. But certainly shows how if Games Workshop cycled the rules and you wanted to keep up with the meta for a Chaos Space Marine unit, you could wind up getting a lot more Havocs than you might think if you were going for WYSIWYG and not just being a bit willing to say, yes, my missile launchers count as las cannons this game or something. Another slightly painful example from 8th and 9th edition I thought were the Intercessor bolt rifles. When the Intercessors first came out, they had different rules for regular bolt rifles, the auto bolt rifle, close assault type ones, and the heavy bolt rifle, slow moving and heavy hitting type version, where if you wanted to have full WYSIWYG for them, you could wind up painting up a fairly silly amount of different Intercessors if you say wanted to try out a different loadout. I felt like these were probably one of the most painful out of any of the war gear choices, just because the difference between the rifles themselves is so tiny. It's literally just the magazine and the sort of scope or ammo drum type bit that's the main difference between them. If you weren't a Space Marine player, then it was kind of unlikely you'd be able to tell the difference between the guns. I'll be honest, this was certainly a level above what I could tolerate in terms of WYSIWYG type things. I never really ran into any issues using the regular bolt rifles, as the different versions of them, even in tournaments, obviously explaining to people beforehand to make sure that they were aware of which version I was using for that. I feel like that was certainly one of the consolidation of weapon profiles that Games Workshop did quite well in 10th. Otherwise, another slightly odd one can be WYSIWYG and paint schemes. As Games Workshop have set out, most rules in 10th edition aren't directly tied to paint schemes anymore. You no longer get specific rules for Ultramarines, Imperial Fists or Salamanders, for example, instead everything being tied to detachments, which does have a few downsides for lore and theming, but also does mean that you can't break WYSIWYG type things by painting things the wrong way for the most part. The only thing that might be a slight exception to that are, say, certain Divergent chapter Space Marines. I think a fair few people might see it as a bit weird if you ran an army entirely of units that came out of Core Codex Space Marines, ran them in the Blood Angels detachment, but had them painted up as Space Wolves. Maybe could lead to a little bit of potential for confusion, though again kind of easily rectified by just explaining what rule set you're using quite clearly before the game. It was a kind of weird situation as well in 9th edition, where Games Workshop ruled at their events that if you had painted your army in a lore appropriate colour scheme, then you had to follow their sub-faction rules. That is a bit of what you see is what you get that, again, I'm not too disappointed to see the back of. It just seemed like a really arbitrary choice that according to GW, if you painted up your Eldari as Beotan, then they'd say that you can't use any of the other Craftworld rules, and in theory decree that you have to stick with the ones that they've given them, even if they've managed to write really bad ones, for example. For war gear and things though, I certainly feel like magnets can help with what you see is what you get. It does take a bit of extra time and hobby work, but it does make things a bit more addition and change proof. And it means that if you want to have an army that sort of makes sense for the current edition that you're in, you don't wind up having to break apart models to rearm them, which is always a bit painful. Or just winding up getting, say, lots of different copies of basically the same model. Say, for example, having a ridiculous amount of Lehman Russ tanks and go down the route of getting new tanks rather than magnetising one turret to be general purpose. Some units are going to be far easier to do that with than others though. Big chunky vehicles with obvious hard points tend to be fairly easy. Maybe skinny infantry with a few tiny attachments but some really obvious and oddly situated war gear choices could be kind of hard or even impossible to magnetise. I feel like for at least a lot of the options, say things like those Chaos Havocs might not be the easiest. They're quite different guns held in different ways, so any one gun that would represent all 5 of them would at least look a fair bit different to any one miniature that you'd normally assemble that way. Between all that, I do feel like there's plenty of fairly good reasonable reasons to proxy. Not wanting to pay for and do all the extra hobby work for very slight war gear choices or other similar models when you could put all that money and hobby effort into other fun miniatures, for example. Perhaps trying things out if you don't actually own the specific miniatures yet, or just playing a game with some unusual rule sets for a bit of variety, maybe having a tank stand in for one that you don't own. Conversions and third-party models might be a bit of a different thing. Perhaps coming up with some cool miniature and then trying to make it work with in-game rules. I've certainly had times where you need to proxy models because you managed to leave 1 or 2 units behind in your army, and you need to rapidly recruit some stand-ins. If you do turn up to a game with proxies in your army though, I do feel like there's lots of different levels of which you can be doing so. As mentioned at the start of the video, I feel like there's quite a lot of miniatures out there that might have some tiny discrepancies in war gear that nobody really cares about. Maybe bolt pistols or other sidearms not being modelled on every single member of a unit. There's no way most people are ever going to care about that to any massively serious extent. It's not like it's really detracting from the primary purpose of the unit. Then maybe the next level up could be proxying weapons. Maybe quite a common one, it could be saying that a power sword is actually a power fist. Kind of reasonable in 10th edition. Lots of people just like to assemble miniatures with the way that they look. and might find the sword a cooler motif than the power fist. And then it's kind of annoying that Games Workshop doesn't balance them particularly well. So basically the power fist will do better in game in the vast majority of situations, and there's no war gear cost, so they're both free. Therefore it could be kind of reasonable to ask your opponent if you mind proxying the sword as a power fist for the game, given that it's basically directly better and you want to have the cool miniature. Maybe another one could be things like special and heavy weapons, kind of similar to the Havoc example earlier, maybe saying things like all my special weapons are plasma guns in this list, regardless of appearance. I've fielded every single plasma gun that I have the model for at the moment, but there are a few melter guns and flamers mixed in. They're basically all plasma for the purposes of this game. Then maybe a level up from that would be proxying entire miniatures, having one miniature stand in from another one, hopefully one that's kind of similar. Maybe you could do something like have a squad of Astra Militarum Tempestus Scions stand in for some Genestealer Cult Neophytes, for example, as an interesting sort of unit that's got its own lore and backstory, and model their war gear in the appropriate way. Or perhaps again, if you want to try and represent war gear more accurately, you could perhaps have your Scion squad have one guy tag along who's got a plasma gun, and that guy's actually just a regular guardsman. Certainly if the rest of the unit is made up of regular scions, I feel like few people are really going to notice the one interloper who doesn't quite fit in, at least if they're all painted in a similar way. Like the war gear, I feel like this is generally going to be most helpful if there's just one or two clear classes of infantry or tanks that are quite visually distinct from each other. I feel like usually you could expect your opponent to maybe remember one or two substitutions in an army, but if it starts getting more complex than that, then there's probably going to be issues. On that theme though, let's talk about a couple of the more obvious issues with proxying. Maybe that first one from a gameplay type perspective could be misleading information to your opponent. One example that confused me before was when an opponent basically had all their tanks modelled with autocannons and heavy bolters, and so I treated them as such on my first turn, not really worrying too much about their threat against my tanks and vehicles, given that they were probably going to be doing some chip damage but not more than that. And then when it got to my opponent's turn, it turned out that they were actually being proxied for las cannons, and that certainly felt a little bit painful when they just turned around and blew up a load of important stuff that I might have been a bit more wary about otherwise. It was listed on their tournament roster to be fair, which I probably should have checked a little bit more carefully, but still probably the sort of thing that should have been explained at the start of the game. One time I managed to do this wrong myself a little bit was when I used some Skitarii as stand-ins for servitors to go alongside my Space Marines, just because I thought the models looked quite cool and I painted them up quite nicely, and the vast majority of the time they were just supposed to be a cheap little objective holding unit that wasn't really going to do any serious damage at all. I managed to do proxying a bit wrong though by not actually mentioning the proxy at the start of the game, and it actually wound out it was a little bit important at one point, as my opponent charged a last biker unit into that unit at one point in the game, both of us expecting that they'd easily wipe them out, but then he wound up rolling super low, and the servitors get a servo arm attack back, so they managed to kill that biker. And it was only at that point it became clear that my opponent didn't realise that servitors came with servo arms at base, so had a tiny bit of melee threat, even if they hit very inaccurately on a 5+. So even that small proxy on a grunt objective holding unit did do a little bit of accidental deception there because of that situation. I feel in general though, if it's something fairly obvious, like that previous one was saying that all of my special weapons are plasma guns, if that was the only thing that the opponent had to keep in their head, I feel like that's usually going to be at least fairly reasonable. It's probably a lot worse if you've got multiple units like that, where lots of different loadouts are counted as different things. It could be very visually confusing, particularly if your opponent doesn't know that army very well, and could be hard to call out if your opponent makes any sort of mistakes, honest or otherwise, on the board. Otherwise, as mentioned earlier, I feel like one danger of proxying is breaking the immersion and slightly cheapening the spectacle of the game. I think most people don't want every single game to be some sort of big showcase spectacle where there's wondrous painting on both sides. In general, I feel like most people would say that that adds to the experience if both people's armies are looking nice. Very, very heavy proxying with inappropriate stuff, even if it is kind of gameplay clear, could take away from that a bit. Say for example, if you're playing with your Tyranids versus some enemy Space Marines, but then those Space Marines you'd Orc Boys for Intercessors, a Carnifex for a Dreadnought, and their Terminators were just represented by blank bases as they hadn't got around to assembling them yet. Everything might be still kind of clear from a gameplay point of view if it was all explained beforehand, but it might just give you a bit more of a sense that you're playing someone's bits box as opposed to an actual army. On the flip side, I feel like if it's just obvious that loads of awesome hobby effort has been expended on the army, people tend to be a lot more forgiving. whether it's just having loads of theme and a massively cool paint scheme, or maybe some awesome conversions or some fun 3D printed type things that give the faction a different twist. If that's the case, then I feel like people might be a little bit more willing to overlook a few proxies, particularly if just the army that you're playing is kind of a visual treat and can give you a really cool game. Otherwise, for one further issue, I guess proxying could potentially lead to a little bit of modelling for advantage, almost always unintentional, but sometimes it can still be a kind of a big deal. Base size is quite an important one. If the base is too big, then it could help out things like auras for certain characters, or just board control if you've got a lot of units on really big bases they shouldn't normally have. Sometimes that could happen if you've modelled a character on a particularly big, cool, scenic base, and you might just need to remember that, say, their aura abilities and ranges might need to be reduced a bit as a result. Too small bases are kind of common, particularly for sort of legacy miniatures that aren't currently on sale anymore. If you're playing with models with smaller bases, then it means that you could potentially hide them easier, maybe fit in gaps that they'd not be able to if they were deep striking perhaps, or mass more objective control on one tightly packed objective, and probably has the greater scope for giving in-game advantages overall. Otherwise, perhaps height and profile is the other big one. 40k using true line of sight for the most part means that the exact size and shape of a miniature is kind of important. Again, it wouldn't always necessarily cause advantages to have differences, but say having a taller model that's a powerful shooting unit could help you gain line of sight, or having a smaller or less bulky model could potentially help things hide that want to, which could be powerful for melee troops. I'm sure there'll be plenty of examples of people basically having modelled for disadvantage in one way or another. But again, just could be something that needs addressing if you have been using proxies that have either different bases or different sizes to the miniatures that the rules were written for. I feel like for the majority of those issues, you can often clear things up with a clear pre-game discussion, provided the proxy models just aren't completely inappropriate for what they're trying to represent. Talking through the army and just making sure that your opponent absolutely understands what represents what, and then throughout the game giving them reminders if you think that they're not understanding that for some reason, and likely also being ready to be generous if proxying does ever cause confusion, allowing things like takebacks if you might have done something differently. I feel like most of that is just fair play. I say clear communication is probably the easiest thing for war gear type things, just needing to make sure that you do spell it out, and if things are misunderstood, then being generous. And then for any modelling for advantage type things, for bases, I feel like you'd often want to try and find the right size if possible. But if you do have loads of, say, legacy miniatures on cool bases that you don't want to break apart, you probably just need to make sure that you try and find ways to make sure that your bases aren't giving you inadvertent advantages. Say if you are running a smaller base on one particular model, just bear it in mind when you're moving things around and know whether or not it should be able to fit through gaps and things, and if not, just don't do it. I feel like a lot of people maybe don't care too much about that at casual sort of levels of play, but I feel like it's nice to be polite when you can. Model height and dimensions often need to be kind of roughly accurate as well. If you're using a smaller model, then it's worth having something to denote the height. Maybe things like a banner model could be a kind of common solution, or even knowing just how much taller the model should be if there's a close line of sight that needs to be drawn. I do kind of find what's allowed and what's not allowed at things like tournaments and events a kind of interesting discussion point. Often the on-paper requirements for big events and tournaments tend to be that you should try and go for WYSIWYG, everything being represented for what it should be, but in reality I feel like those rules tend to be there just to make sure that people really aren't abusing the system. I do find it really quite common that you run into people proxying things to greater or lesser extent, particularly minor bits of war gear, and usually making sure that any confusion is completely cleared up, and then no one's really got any issues with those small things, provided there's not excessive confusion. It's really not causing problems with the gameplay, which is usually the main focus at these things. Most tournaments tend to have a system where if you've got heavily converted miniatures or 3D printed proxies, you can often send photos of the miniatures to the organisers just to check if this is definitely allowed. And that could be one pathway to go down if you're really unsure. I've found it interesting in the past, though, that people I've talked to have often had absolutely opposite opinions on whether they're proxy in casual versus competitive play. I've certainly talked to some people who say that they're never proxy in competitive play, but would often do so in casual for fun and trying out other things, as they just feel like it's a lower stakes and more do whatever you want kind of environment. On the other hand, though, I feel like you could have an argument that most of the time in casual play, proxying to try and gain rules advantages and things might feel just a little bit try hard sometimes, particularly if both players are playing with de-optimized lists that aren't trying to just utterly gain every single advantage. And as just mentioned, I feel like a little bit of very reasonable and well explained proxying really doesn't hurt things too much in tournament play. Obviously avoiding things like modelling for advantage or causing the opponent confusion. In any case though, I'll certainly be interested to hear your guys' takes on this. I do find it a bit of an interesting debate. I think my general takeaway is that WYSIWYG is nice to aim for if it's convenient. It's quite nice just for ease of gameplay and also setting immersion to be able just to play with the miniatures that they have using the war gear that they're truly armed with. Though it definitely does have a bunch of annoying practical downsides, lots of unnecessary hobby work or money spent if you want to try and tweak a loadout and have a unit armed with something slightly different. I think for that reason it's often pretty reasonable to do a bit of proxying. Most people tend to be at least fairly well accepting of it if you're doing it politely. And you just need to avoid modelling for advantage, misleading opponents, or ruining the spectacle of the game too much. If not done particularly well though, I certainly feel like proxying could certainly impact on the opponent's enjoyment if done badly, could be seen as a bit impolite, and particularly if it's combined with doing a lot of other things that annoy the other person. It's all a bit of a balance with the overall social interaction. In any case, I think I'll leave that there for this one. Look forward to having a read of the comments later on. Let me know your takes or any common proxies or things that you've run into in the past. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, including new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, or you'd just like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos earlier, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.